Welcome, everyone. I see that our numbers are populating on the participants number. I'll wait just another couple seconds as we have people pop on. All right, let's get started. I think people are still joining us. Good afternoon, everyone. I guess if you're on the West Coast, still good morning, everyone. My name is Phyllis Wolfram, and I am the Executive Director for CASE, the Council of Administrators of Special Education. And I am excited to welcome you to today's webinar, Autistic Person or Person with Autism. Our webinar will focus on identity and autism. I would like to start by introducing my new good friend, Dr. Celest Austin. And while growing up with her autistic sister, Amanda, Celeste grew to appreciate her sister's way of thinking. Dr. Austin was alarmed how most resources available did not nurture her sister's unique way of thinking. With such limited resources available, Dr. Austin's family made sure to celebrate whenever Amanda accomplished anything with cheer. GoManda, GoManda. From then on, Dr. Austin decided to dedicate her life to autism and studied the uniqueness of autism. After obtaining her MD and PhD from the University of Texas Health Science Center in San Antonio in 2016, Dr. Austin knew she wanted to do more and walked away from further medical training to found a company called GoManda, named after her sister, Amanda. Inspired by the unique learning style of her sister, GoManda is a company dedicated to celebrating the unique mind of autism. GoManda has created a platform that teaches vocabulary using strength-based teaching, a teaching method that works with autism's unique learning style rather than against it. But I do have to tell you a personal story of how Celeste and I met. And Celeste was actually doing some advertising on a site that we access called Multiview. It is an agreement we have with them, and I do get to approve the ads that go out. And Dr. Austin had used identity first language. And as a special ed director, I was so used to people first language. And so I said to Multiview, she needs to change that. She's got to change that. Directors won't open that, I think, if they don't see people first language. And Dr. Austin graciously changed it. We had not yet met or not yet spoken. I did ask for our contacts at Multiview to connect us so that we could talk and I could tell her what my perspective was. And at some point I thought I was going to educate Dr. Austin on people first language. Little did I know that she educated me on something new, new to my thinking, new to what I would say the field, but I don't think it's so new to the field. I just think it was something that maybe special ed directors aren't being exposed to, and this awareness. So I hope that you will enjoy today's webinar, one, just learning more about autism, and we'll continue this dialogue, I think, over 2 weeks. So I'm going to turn it over to Celeste. Celeste, I can't thank you enough for joining CASE and partnering with us so that we can continue to create awareness and education for all those in special education.
Thank you, Phyllis. Yes, it was actually a really interesting way that we met. And I think it's such an honor to kind of now be able to educate and just kind of bring awareness of this topic that I really feel is really important. And so I'm so excited to share this. This is kind of the joy of what I'm doing. And this is kind of the mission behind me and my company. So I would love to just get started and let's get going with this. So I want to thank Phyllis for this opportunity. I think that she has been a great champion of listening and being receptive. So I'm very honored to meet her. And so this has been an incredible opportunity. And she's done a great job of introducing me. So really nothing much to add, only that, we are a company that's just been out for about 1.5 years, and we've been really about championing the learning style of autism, and especially when it comes to vocabulary comprehension. And this is a company that's obviously inspired by my own autistic sister. Today, I really wanted to talk a little bit and elaborate a little bit about person first versus identity first language. I really wanted to start off with the power of language. And then as we move towards learning about person first and identity first language, talking a little bit about the history behind it. And then eventually kind of talking about what, as educators, you can do. And just to do some little bit of housekeeping, as Phyllis alluded, that next week we have part 2. So one of the things that I told Phyllis, I was like, I want to do this webinar, but I also want to make sure that we empower autistic individuals in speaking about this, because I'm not autistic, but I'm very much in tune with the community of what's going on with the autism movement. But I really want autistic individuals to have the opportunity to speak as well. So that is actually next week, same time as today. So if you're registered, I believe that you are registered for both. And then, of course, please ask questions. Go ahead and put them in the chat. We'll do our best to answer them after the webinar. So I wanted to start off the talk with the power of language. And I think a lot of us kind of know some sense of what that means, but I wanted to start off with this amazing quote by an autistic individual. Right from the start, from the time someone came up with the word autism, the condition has been judged from the outside by its appearances and not from the inside, according to how it is experienced. And I think this is a powerful way of kind of setting the stage of this talk, because we need to remember that if we're not autistic, we cannot judge and make decisions about language and identity on our own. And I think this is a great way to start this talk. One thing I want, I think is important is that language is performative. Words have a lot of power. And I think in the last 3 years, we kind of can understand this, because we can see based on social media and all of that the way we frame things really influences the way people can conceptualize social matters, political attitudes, events, and situations. I think we all know on some level that there are just little ways that someone can frame something that really gives a hint and window into how they feel about something. It can be used in constructive of social life. Through language, we can make a case, we can make a particular stance and produce identities. Words and the language that we use in society can really help shape conscious and unconscious beliefs. And I think as we know the power of social media, I think that this is becoming more and more kind of known now. The way that the little particular ways that we say things and we use words can really, like I said, be a window into what that person is thinking. And one thing I think is really, really important too, when it comes to education, is that what we say or write produces a specific version of the world, of oneself and others. And especially with a population that's, when children, very impressionable, this is very important, right? How we say things really can help shape how they see themselves. And so language can convey and shapes and perpetuates ideology. So I wanted to set that stage before we go through kind of what we're going to be talking about, which is person first versus identity first language. And what do I mean by that? Person first language is person with autism, while identity first language is autistic person. And those are the kind of, when we're going to start using that language, that's what I am referring to. And I think before we can really dive into why this is something that's important to the autistic community, is to kind of go back and go through the history of disability movement and even the current autism movement. And I think what's important to realize is that throughout time, whenever a disability comes into light, there are actually 3 waves of that disability movement. And this has been researched on based on just looking at, especially in the 21st century, kind of the waves that occur in every disability movement. So there's 3 kind of, and it kind of makes sense, right? So first is the professionals that come in and kind of define what that disability is. Typically, they're kind of trying to figure out assessment, trying to figure out metrics and identification rubrics to kind of help identify these disabilities. Typically, those come at a deficit-based viewpoint. The second wave that we typically see in disability movements is parents and caregivers now speaking up. They're advocating for the individuals that they're caring for, maybe demanding for fixes and cures, maybe demanding for more funding, maybe demanding for more resources, but they typically are the ones that fuel a lot of policy changes because they're the ones who truly care. But the third wave that's important to note is the self. These are the individuals who are disabled themselves, who are now coming of age and then demanding and wanting acceptance and inclusion. And these are all three important waves. And if we look at the history of autism, we're noticing now that we're living currently in the third wave, and I will show you guys that. So, I'm sure everyone kind of knows the gist of the history of autism, but in the 1900s, really the concept of autism was introduced. It was really not much known about it. And so for a large part of, prior to the millennium starting, we saw a lot of changes within the medical world about what autism was. There was all kinds of ideas of what it was. Was it part of schizophrenia? Was it a seizure? So there were things that were really changing and shaping as professionals were trying to determine what autism was. As that kind of became more solidified, we saw a huge wave of parents wanting to advocate for their children. We can see that that's when the Education for All Handicapped Children Act came about, which eventually changed to the IDEA, which we're all familiar with. A lot of really changes in the diagnosis was kind of also trying to match what was happening on the disability, the acts that were coming out as well. So there were a lot of changes happening in the 90s. And it wasn't towards the end of the 90s that we saw a wave of self-advocates coming through. You may remember Temple Grandin coming out at this point, but there was a whole slew, and there still is a whole slew of autism advocates who are really trying to speak out and trying to showcase the experience from their point of view. I did put on here, and if you notice, the Wakefield vaccine controversy. If you guys don't really know what that is, that's when a infamous, I should say, scientist, Dr. Wakefield, came up with the idea that vaccines cause autism, which has been disproven and also been known to be fabricated data. I want you guys to notice this because this actually shaped policy. It kind of disrupted the self-advocacy for autism. And as you can see, the act that came about during this time was Combating Autism Act. And you can imagine even using that language, how harmful that was for a person who is autistic and looking at that as if autism was a war or some disease or something that needed to go away. And that was during a time when we thought vaccines cause autism because of Dr. Wakefield. But we know all that has been changed since then, and the autism movement has been moving about as we speak. And so just to kind of summarize a little bit about the history of both, person first language came from good intentions. It emerged in the 70s when the disability movement, the disability policies were being shaped. And it was all about putting the person first before the disability. And it was important at the time as there were a slew of other terminology being used, which were very harmful, derogatory as well. So this was an attempt to create more humanity in the disability movement at the time, the very beginnings. It is still widely used amongst professionals. I come from medicine and academia, and yes, this is terminology that's still being used to this day, and education as well. And we will elaborate more on this, but it also comes from a world of the medical model of disability, and we will elaborate about that in just a sec. Now, identity first language kind of emerged in the 90s. What was interesting about this is it emerged during actually with the deaf and blind community. They spoke out in the mid-90s about the fact that they did not like the terminology being used in those acts that we talked about. They did not like the person first language. They felt very much that their blindness and their deafness was such integral of who they were. They could not be anyone different without those conditions that they wanted to go away with the person first language and just be called deaf or blind. This is actually what the autism movement is mirroring after. They were inspired by the deaf and blind movement. And as we'll explain later, that was kind of the inspiration behind the autism movement of using identity first language. And as I just said, for these individuals who choose the identity first language, disability for them is really part of their identity. They absolutely cannot see themselves separate from that, which they feel the person first language is trying to demonstrate. It is widely used among self-advocates and neurodiversity experts and allies like me. And it's actually growing, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. The use of this language is growing as we speak. And the identity first language also comes from the social model of disability. Again, I will do a comparison of both of these in just a second. But ultimately, person first language came from a place of eliminating generalizations, assumptions, and stereotypes by focusing on the person rather than the disability. Whereas identity first language was all about people who wanted to experience, people who experience their world through their disability, making it a major contributor to who they are. And they felt like it shouldn't be separated from them as a person. So what is the medical versus the social model of disability? So medical model versus social model. So there's really different ways of seeing disability. Medical model really is about seeing autism as a deficit that impairs them from functioning normally. Of course, I really don't like the word normal. I do use it one more time without the quotations, only as to make it a stark contrast in a way, but those kind of terminologies, what does that really mean? But really so for this medical model, it's about seeing the person or the condition as more of a deficit, and what can we do to fix it? Whereas the social model is really about seeing autism as just a cognitive difference. For the medical model, people tend to be defined by their deficits, meaning what they need to work on. Whereas in the social model, there's a flip side of looking at what is it about the attitudes, the barriers, and the lack of support from society that is making that person in quote unquote disabled. Basically, what are the deficits in society in a way? In the medical model as well, these deficits are considered abnormal and should be fixed, cured, or treated. And I did use the word abnormal because actually those are terminologies really used in medical journals to this day. It's changing, but change is slow. And while the social model is saying that autism is and this is where I use the word normal variant of society, meaning that it happens at a rate that is not abnormal, I guess. For the medical model as well, once a person can rise above their autism, they can finally fit into society and be whatever normal is. Whereas the social model is, as a community, let's try to figure out what are the barriers that exist that are preventing autistic individuals to thrive, and how can we support them? So these are just two different ways that we can look at the same thing, and we can look at the same thing very differently. And if I haven't quite gotten it, summarized it quite well, the medical model really puts the problem on the person. What can they do to fix themselves so that they can fit in? Whereas the social model is, let's look at the barriers, look at the lack of resources, accommodations that is preventing this person from thriving. And this is a really cool, I guess, cartoon, if you want to call it that, or infographic that was made by an autistic individuals. But really another way of summarizing it, people are in the medical model, people are disabled by their medical conditions. And this can lead to harmful thinking of, well, they will always be a dependent. They will always be limited. That's where the harmful aspects of the medical model can occur. Whereas in the social model, since we're focused on the societal aspects, and that the people are disabled by the barriers, we can try to find more resources to help them. So what about, the schools? What are we missing there? What are we missing in, for example, transportation, or even for language interpreters, things like that, focusing on those things rather than the person. And a little fun little cartoon as well is when we look at the medical model of disability, and if we were to really be subscribed to that idea, we would see somebody who's in a wheelchair as, oh, if there's stairs, that's their problem. We're not even going to try to accommodate for this person. No ramps, nothing like that. They should cure her. They should give her prosthetics. Whereas in the social model, let's try to figure out another solution that's not the stairs. Let's build a ramp. And how do we, as a society, or even education, or whatever profession, try to maybe bridge the gap between the medical model and the social model? Well, one thing we have to learn about is the double empathy problem. And this was an idea that came about by an autistic researcher. It's a really interesting idea where he came about this idea as a lived experience of what he went through trying to accommodate and exist as an autistic person. So double empathy problem is that there is an empathy gap between the autistic person and a non-autistic person. What that truly means is, while growing up, an autistic person spends a long time trying to understand the non-autistic person, or what I call the neurotypic world. Neurotypical means a person who is not autistic or not neurodivergent. And so an autistic person grows up understanding that when they approach a non-autistic person, that person will misinterpret their communication style. This is something that they learn very early on, and they have to adjust. That this non-autistic person may gravitate towards other neurotypical individuals, so may have successful interactions with them, but not necessarily with the autistic individual. And they will make a non-autistic person will make a lot of incorrect assumptions about autism. And a lot of the social settings are designed for neurotypical individuals. Whereas an autistic individual, a non-autistic person, doesn't really, at least in the way that we frame our society, doesn't spend a lot of time trying to understand an autistic person. Now, I know this is different for educators because you probably spend a long time trying to understand your autistic students. But for the most part, in general, a non-autistic person doesn't spend the time to understand that an autistic person may struggle to read between the lines, may have actually successful interactions with other autistic individuals, may actually feel the pressure to mask and to fit in with other neurotypical people, and also maybe struggling with a lot of the sensory distractions in the environment. So these are things that there's a discrepancy, and so there's a lot of pressure on an autistic person to understand a non-autistic person, but that same pressure does not exist for a non-autistic person. And so both struggle to understand each other's differences as a result. There's an OT that's amazing. She's neurodivergent, and she says something really beautiful. We talk so much about how autistic kids struggle with perspective taking and social skills, but the truth is that non-autistic people have a really hard time taking the perspective of autistic people and using the social skills that help them feel at ease. And one of the examples that she makes is social stories. We have so many social stories to help autistic individuals understand the neurotypical world, but how many social stories do we have for non-autistic individuals to understand autistic individuals? And there is a discrepancy. And I feel like the solution is professionals like you, educators can be that bridge. The more that you know, the more that you can help build that bridge between these two, between an autistic individual and a non-autistic person. So I really feel like that is the role of an educator and a professional. So going back to identity first language, it turns out that the growing population of autistic adults that are growing into adulthood, 88.6% of them really truly prefer identity first language. That is what IFL means. And it turns out those parents also prefer it as well. And this was a survey of over 1,000 people. And the thinking behind it is that, and this is a famous infographic that I kind of just made into the style of this talk, but this is a very, very famous infographic about why this is so important to the autistic community. when you use terminology like person suffers from autism, obviously that tells the person who's listening that you believe that the person is suffering, that this is this terrible condition that this person has. I know that there's a lot of people who love to use the word person on the spectrum, and that is a little bit better. But I think for autistic individuals, they feel like they're just on it. Like they're not, it's not a part of them. They're on it, meaning they could just get off of it. Person has autism, which is what we've been talking about, person first language. It's an accessory now. Autism is an accessory, a disease that they can just have cured or taken off. But autistic person really embodies that idea that it's an identity. It's who they are. It's ingrained. It's so part of their daily life and perspective and how they see the world. And it really honors that. And, I think it's important to also understand that there is societal impact to using language. This is a really surprising statistic, but a lot of suicide and filicide, which is, unfortunately, the murder of children, victims are autistic. And a lot of when you hear the last words of these parents, you'll hear something like, I loved my child very much, but I hated autism and I wanted autism out of my life. And so this was actually a quote in this paper talking about kind of how language relates to the violence in our world. And so I think it's really important to know this because language can have a powerful impact on how we see things, as I've mentioned. By separating autism from the person, we formulate an existence or possibility of that life without autism. Yet autism cannot ever be separate from a person. To combat autism is to combat autistic people. And one of the other things I wanted to note is kind of the mental health crisis that's occurring with autistic individuals. And a lot of this is something that a lot of autistic individuals attribute partially to the societal expectations. So autistic individuals are 3 times more likely to commit suicide. There's actually 70% of autistic youth have a mental health condition, which include depression and anxiety, and they're 4 times more likely to be depressed. And a lot of this is coming from an idea of not being accepted and not giving the tools to kind of thrive in a society that they feel is against them. I wanted to go over some other terminology because I feel like I wouldn't be doing any justice to this talk without just talking about a little bit of the terminology that is commonly used in the autism movement. Ableism is one of the ideas of there's this discrimination of and social prejudice against people with disabilities or disabled people. And it's based on the belief that typical abilities are superior. Ableist language kind of is rooted upon the idea that there is a hierarchy. And there's certain clues to how a person feels about them through their language, as you can expect. The other terminology, and I did hint at this, masking. And I think a lot of us can identify with this. But masking is hiding your true self in an effort to fit with societal standards and expectations. From my understanding with talking with other autistic adults and individuals, masking is not, I think we all kind of do that, but the extent that an autistic person does is quite substantial and can be very draining. And then the idea of neurodiversity, which I think is getting some stride now, is the idea that there's a range of different brain wirings that exist in our society, and there's different ways of processing and interacting with the world, and there's no right or wrong way of thinking. And this is kind of where the movement is actually is the neurodiversity movement as well. And neurodiversity also encompasses other cognitive differences like ADHD, dyscalculia, dyslexia as well. So there's a whole wide range of other neuronal brain wiring differences that are pushing for acceptance and believing that there is no right or wrong way of thinking. There are some current changes happening. So in the recent Autism Awareness Day official, I guess, proclamation by the White House, they are using identity first language. So the changes are happening slowly but surely, and it's very impressive in the ways that I'm seeing it. And so if there's any hope, it's right here. So what can you do as educators? I really truly believe educators are a child's ally, because a lot of times, sometimes at home, they're not getting that ally that they need. And I truly believe educators can be that person. But I also think that it's important to be flexible and to always learn and ask. I think one of the first steps that a lot of you guys are taking is kind of learning about this. But I think always ask and listen to how someone will want to address themselves. It's difficult when it is a child, but I think as educators, you can make that call. Maybe parents can help choose the language, but also let them know that there are other options, and that maybe this is something to be introduced when they're mature enough as well. Conversations with parents, especially when there's transition planning before post-secondary, that is an important time for that conversation to occur. And, you know, allow the students to define their preferences and interests. Educators can think about adding language as that preference as well. There was a great paper that came out where a bunch of researchers and autistic researchers came together to kind of give a guideline of what proper language to use in professional settings. So I wanted to go ahead and just go through the 7 things, and it'll be very quick, but there are 7 questions to help professionals and educators to determine if they've adequately considered the impact of their language choices. So would I use this language if I were in conversation with an autistic person? Does my language suggest that autistic people are inherently inferior to non-autistic people, or assert that they lack something fundamental to being human? Does my language suggest that autism is something to be fixed, cured, controlled, or even avoided? Does my language unnecessarily medicalize autism when describing educational supports? Does my language suggest to lay people that my goal of my approach is behavioral control and normalization rather than granting as much autonomy and agency to autistic people as reasonably possible? Am I using particular words or phrases solely because it's a tradition in my field, even though autistic people have expressed that such language can be stigmatizing? Does my language unnecessarily other autistic people by suggesting that characteristics of autism bear no relationship to characteristics of non-autistic people? And so these are questions that I felt were so powerful. They come from the community. They come from actually scientists working together. And I think they're really relevant questions. I think everyone's going to get a PowerPoint of this so that you can reflect on those. But I leave you guys with this, equipped with the history, the models, the caregivers, parents' preferences, the preference of the autistic community, and most importantly, the student's preference. I think educators will find the right answer that resonates with them. And this comes from that same paper that I talked about. And with the autistic researchers and other researchers, they have a huge list of what could be potentially harmful language and suggestions of alternatives. Of course, once you get your PowerPoint, you will see these. I'm not going to go through them, but there is a whole list of suggestions of how we can have more empowering language. But that is it. Phyllis, do you have anything to add?
I do. I just wanted to also, as you were talking about very specifically your charts on identity first versus people first language, and what do we do in schools, and what would I do? I've kind of been monitoring the chat, and I know people could not get in the chat for some reason. You could see it, but not type in it. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and I'm watching that as well. But I did want to say, what is it that we do? What is it that we do as educators, and how do we determine people first versus identity first language? I think what we know as educators when we're in elementary school, many times we think it's really important that as young children are in our school buildings, we look at them first and foremost as a young student. And that is where, it's the student first. We want teachers to look at the kiddo, look at how they're functioning, not to look at the disability. So that has been the big push in education, because it has, I don't know that there's been research on it, but I think we have known as educators that many times the label has defined students, and somehow teachers think there are limitations when we say the learning disabled classroom or the learning disabled student. So we always tried to say people first, John, who has a learning disability, not the learning disabled student. And so I think we have to be real sensitive to time, place, and preference of parents, especially when we're dealing with very young children. So I think this is a conversation for educators to have, especially around the identification of autism or the medical diagnosis of autism. That, because in schools, we identify for services under the IDEA. We don't really diagnose, but medical profession diagnosis. So when we identify educationally, or when we have a diagnosis that is medical around autism, this could be some education that we provide to parents, especially as their children get older. Because what we're finding is that in the older population, our young adults that are going into the workforce, are young adults who are going into college who are autistic, prefer autistic, the identity first language. And I think, Celeste, you did an excellent job of walking through all of that information today. So I would just say, from an educator's point of view, as a local director, this would be a conversation I'd be having with at IEP meetings, or with parents at a parent-teacher conference, educating them, providing more information. This recording will be available to you on the GoManda website as soon as it perfects in our Zoom system. Every one of you will receive a link to the recording tomorrow, along with the PowerPoint. Celeste, I don't know if you want to comment on my comments, but there are some questions in the chat that are in the Q&A box that I want to pose to you.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I can do a brief comment. I think, I agree those labels can be harmful, but only if the perception of those labels are harmful as well. So reinventing the way we see autism is important as well. But I agree, this is a conversation, and I obviously totally understand where person first comes from. But of course, I'm coming from a place of just honoring the community. But I would love to answer some questions.
Yeah. There. This may be more of a comment than a question, but I'll let you react to it. And I think this is individual preference. I want to preface this statement, and I support this comment from this individual parent. And the comment is, this is a very different viewpoint for me. I'm an educator and a parent of an adult daughter with autism. I just want people to see her as a young woman and not, autistic woman. For me, it's more respectful to say that she's a woman who happens to have autism, but that should define her, but that should, or I think, let me get this right, but should that define her? Was a question mark then. I know it's part of her, and I understand that, but it's not her. And I respect that position. I don't know if you want to comment.
It's definitely an individual's preference, just like any identity. And I think the purpose of this is just to show that a vast majority of autistic individuals prefer the identity first language. But again, it's 88.6. There's still a remaining percentage that actually don't mind the person first language. So I do want to say that doesn't mean that we just, like anything, we don't just blanket use terminology, and we have to honor what that person wants. And it's just about just thinking about that there is another option.
Right. Another comment in the Q&A, I have also seen much discussion regarding low functioning and high functioning descriptors and how the autistic population does not want to continue these terms or continue to use these terms.
Yes, and that's absolutely true. I think the reasoning behind that is the connotation behind those two labels. I think what they would prefer is just to identify the supports and needs that individual needs. That feels more, and for them, feels more, I guess, humane, because you're actually really showing that every individual is different on what they need and what they need for support, rather than just putting a function label. And so that's where that's coming from. But yeah, definitely that is something that is hoping, at least the autistic movement is hoping to age out.
Another question for you. Can you talk more about the strategies educators are using and how these impact autistic individuals? For example, reinforcement, visuals, direct teaching, replacement behaviors, etc. Autistic individuals are indicating that these have been harmful to them. What is your advice to educators?
Yeah, I mean, I have also been listening to this as well. And I think it's important to have a balanced idea, right? Listening to the community, because we can always learn. There are ideas that I kind of agree with some of the things that they criticize. And they're really the ideas that are at heart are about replacing who they are. And I think it's something where as you learn more about autistic individuals as adults, you can really kind of hone in on what that really means. But for example, stimming, if it doesn't hurt anyone, that's something that a lot of autistic individuals say, let's just embrace it, give them time to stim. That's necessary for self-regulation and for sensory, supporting their sensory needs. Things like that, rather than trying to extinguish that, are kind of what I think the autistic community is trying to change. So embracing a lot of, I guess, the supports and needs that autistic individuals need, rather than trying to replace them with something that's considered normal. But yes, you're absolutely right. That is something that is happening. You are actually completely correct. And like I said, I think the heart of it is about preserving who they are. I think that is really the heart of it. And I hope that answers it.
Yeah. A question, will we get a certificate for participation? I can say yes, that will be emailed in the morning along with the recording and a copy of the PowerPoint presentation. Not a question, just saying I loved your talk. So thank you, Dr. Austin, for that. I think this is just a comment. I have seen the preference for listing the level or type of support needed.
Yes. Yeah, rather than using the function labels, absolutely. That's a lot more descriptive and helpful for that individual.
If, here's a question, if an autistic person prefers people first language, does that mean they need to be taught to switch to identity first language? Do you feel there can be a mix and or a mesh between the two ideas?
Yes, and like I said, it is a personal preference. I completely agree. I think everybody has a right to have the identity of what they want. Like I said, 88.6% like the identity first, but that doesn't mean all of them. And as long as they know both sides, that's fine. That's a preference. And I typically, what I do is I ask somebody who I know who is autistic, which one would you like? Which label, or not label, but which identity do you identify with? And I can honor that with them, or I listen to how they describe themselves as well.
All right. Another question. What's a nice, polite, non-ableist way to ask an autistic person which they prefer, people first language or identity first language?
Typically, I don't just straight up ask. I do listen to how they describe others and how they describe themselves. If it doesn't come up, I kindly just ask. And actually, I'm telling you, people appreciate it, because it means that and you want to honor their request or what they want. And I think don't be shy. I think it's quite okay. You can just say, hey, I just wanted to, we've been talking. I really enjoyed our conversation. I just want to make sure that I respect the way that you want to be identified. Do you prefer person first or identity first language? I think that's just a great way to do it. I wouldn't straight up start with that, but I think there's a way to do it that's not, I guess, awkward.
Another question. And I know your work is not necessarily around those with intellectual disabilities, but we'll see if you have an answer to this. How do people diagnosed or identified with intellectual disability prefer to be identified?
That's a great question. I actually had a slide about this. Actually, when you interview people with intellectual disabilities, they actually prefer person first language. So that's something that I think it's about 70% actually prefer the person first. And I'm not sure if it's because we haven't had a good identity first label, because it really has, I don't know, there's a lot of different language that could be used, but it turns out, yes, for that population, they do actually prefer person first. So great question.
Next, thank you for the good work that you're doing, Dr. Austin. I am a middle school special educator and was only taught person first language during my schooling. I love that you suggested having a discussion during IEP meetings where I anticipate this becoming difficult is when students are not aware that they have autism. I personally feel it is important that students are aware. How do you suggest broaching this topic with parents?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I've had this question before. I think it's about how the parent sees autism. If they truly see it part of the neurodiversity spectrum of just neuronal differences that we just normally have in our society, and just have it framed in a way of, and then, your thinking is different because of XYZ, and we call that autism. I think that it really starts with the mindset and the way that we see things. We frame it, like I mentioned, the linguistic framing of everything really matters. If we see it from that perspective, where it's not a deficit, it is just a difference, it can be framed in a very strength-based, empowering way. And it can be very transparent. These are your strengths, and then these are your weaknesses. Just like I have strengths and I have weaknesses. It doesn't mean it's good or bad. It doesn't mean it's right or wrong. It's just a difference. And I think that it is important for a child to know these things. I think it's important because it helps shape what they know, what they're good at, and it helps give them transparency about what the education system or what their educators are trying to work on with them. And so I personally like that, but of course it is also a preference of a family as well. But I think conversation with the family about how they see autism is important. Do they see it from that angle, or do they see it more as something that's more negative? And that's when I think an educator can help bridge that.
Okay. Do you have thoughts on the puzzle piece versus the infinity symbol? The ASAN advocates for the infinity symbol and wear red instead.
Yes, and I personally am a subscriber to the infinity and the red instead. And this is because, like I said, we have autistic individuals on our team. I wanted to respect and honor them. I do understand where the puzzle piece came from. And it comes from a history, like we've talked about, where autism was really viewed in a very negative way. And I think that the autism movement is trying to reinvent all of that. And so I totally respect their whole attempt, their whole mission to reinvent, and I want to be a part of it. So for me personally, I do like the infinity and the red instead.
There was a question. I don't think you were automatically signed up for both sessions, and I just did some double checking with Debbie. The registration was separate for each session. Know that session 2 will be different. It is a continuation where we will be you will see some interviews with autistic individuals and their point of view. Dr. Austin and I did a couple of those interviews together. She did some on her own. So it is a very different perspective we would like to share with you. And these individuals agreed to be interviewed and for this to be aired. And so we're very excited about part 2. We'll send out some clarification emails around that as well. Celeste, would you want to comment on any of that?
Yeah, my mistake for thinking that was one link.
Yeah.
I apologize for that misinformation.
That's okay. No, that's all right. The next question. I agree all people have the right to identify as they wish when they write for the magazine I own, as I respect all voices. Any suggestions on how to respond to the people who are angered by those who insist others comply to their personal choice?
You know, I've actually encountered this personally. I'm not even autistic, but when people comment on my use of language, and it's always surprising to me that people are resistant to change, even if the actual autistic person is actually requesting it. You know, there's nothing you can really do about changing someone's perspective. You're just going to have to distance yourself from them. You can't change their perspective, unfortunately. This is something I've learned the hard way. And if they do know about the perspective of both and they're still resistant, that is a lost cause, in my opinion. And it's unfortunate, and it happens all the time in every movement. So it's unfortunate, and I don't really have you can't really change the advice. So I would just say, you practice the boundaries.
Yeah. That is all of the questions. They were great questions. Thank you everyone for being with us today and joining in to the conversation and the discussion. Q&A was great. So that really does conclude our webinar. I will toss it to Dr. Austin for any final comments and maybe invitations for next Thursday. But again,
Yes.
On behalf of CASE, thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. And yes, next week, we will be talking with actually autistic individuals, those who were diagnosed early, had gone through the educational system, and their opinion, and also their preference. And you'll be surprised to see that there's actually a variation of what they prefer for either identity first or person first. And I was really excited about that, and I hope you guys join us. There will be a separate link, apparently. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. My email is austin@gomanda.com. And just check us out, www.gomanda.com.
Yeah, and again, you'll get the PowerPoint in the morning and Celeste's email as well as the website. I think I did put that in the chat, but everything will be in your inbox tomorrow. That probably will come from Debbie Magnifico, our administrative assistant. So look for an email from Debbie Magnifico. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week, I hope.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye now.